Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't just inconvenient. It was a predator that stalked entire villages, claiming lives with the quiet efficiency of frost creeping across window panes. You're about to discover how medieval peasants faced down the coldest nights in human history, armed with nothing but wool, wits, and an iron determination to see another spring. Picture yourself in 14th century England as November's first bitter wind cuts through your threadbare cloak. The sun sets at 4 in the afternoon, and you won't see its weak rays again for nearly 16 hours. Your breath forms clouds that freeze instantly, and the ground beneath your feet rings like iron with each step. You probably won't survive this, at least not with your modern sensibilities intact. Medieval winters killed more people than plague, famine, and warfare combined, yet somehow generation after generation endured. Tonight, you'll learn their secrets. You'll discover why peasants slept with pigs, how they turned urine into hand warmers, and why a good fire was worth more than gold. We'll explore the ingenious, disgusting, and surprisingly effective methods that kept our ancestors alive when temperatures plummeted and death knocked at every door. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I love seeing our little global community of history nerds and insomniacs come together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't the picturesque snow globe scene you might imagine. It was a months-long siege that began in October and didn't lift its stranglehold until April. The Little Ice Age, which peaked between 1300 and 1700, brought temperatures so brutal that the Thames regularly froze solid enough for ox-drawn carts to cross. You're talking about winters where the average temperature dropped 10 degrees below what we consider normal today. The medieval peasant, let's call him Thomas, faced this onslaught with technology that hadn't changed much since the Roman Empire.
No Central Eating, no Insulate Walls, no Veaterstripping.
Just raw human ingenuity and a stubborn refusal to die. Thomas knew that surviving winter meant planning like a general preparing for war, because that's essentially what it was. A war against nature herself. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually felt the cold less than we do, or if they simply developed a higher pain tolerance through necessity. What we do know is that the average medieval peasant burned approximately 4,000 calories per day just trying to stay warm. Nearly twice what modern manual laborers consume. Their bodies became furnaces, converting every scrap of food into precious heat. You push open the heavy wooden door of Thomas's winter home, and immediately your modern sensibilities revolt. The space before you measures roughly 12 feet by 16 feet, smaller than most modern bedrooms. Yet here lives Thomas, his wife Margaret, their 4 children, 2 elderly parents, and tonight, a pregnant sow named Brunhild. Welcome to medieval winter housing, where privacy was a luxury no one could afford and survival trumped comfort every single time. The walls rise barely 7 feet high, constructed from whatever materials the lord of the manor allowed his serfs to gather. You're looking at a patchwork of mud, straw, animal dung, and timber. A technique called wattle and daub that sounds charmingly rustic until you realize it's essentially living inside a giant mud pie. The gaps between the wooden framework are stuffed with moss, rags, and more dung, creating insulation with an R value that would make modern builders weep. Above your head, the thatched roof sags under the weight of snow and decades of hasty repairs. It's a living ecosystem up there. Mice, insects, and occasionally birds have made homes in the straw, their droppings filtering down like the world's least pleasant confetti. But here's the genius part. That thick thatch actually provides decent insulation, trapping warm air like a medieval sleeping bag turned inside out. The floor beneath your feet consists of packed earth mixed with rushes, herbs, and yes, more animal waste. Medieval people called this aromatic carpet strewing herbs, though you'd probably call it a health code violation. Historians still argue whether this floor covering was changed seasonally or simply added to layer by layer, creating what one chronicler described as an ancient collection of beer, grease, fragments of fish, and everything nasty. The single room serves every conceivable function. That corner with the straw mattress, bedroom for the parents. The wooden bench along the wall, kitchen table, work surface, and children's bed rolled into one. The area near the door where Brunhild the pig currently snorts contentedly?
Livestock barn, obviously.
Medieval peasants weren't just sharing their homes with animals out of affection. They were harvesting body heat like it was a cash crop. You notice there are no windows in the traditional sense, just wooden shutters covering holes in the walls. Glass was impossibly expensive, so most peasant homes relied on oiled cloth or animal bladders stretched across openings to let in dim light while keeping out the worst of the wind. On the coldest nights, even these pathetic barriers were sealed shut with whatever was handy. More rags, mud, or simply boards nailed across the gaps. The most important feature of any medieval peasant home was the hearth, and Thomas's version sits dead center of the room like a shrine to survival. It's not the cozy stone fireplace of your imagination, but rather a circular depression in the dirt floor surrounded by stones. Smoke rises toward a hole in the roof, though rises is generous. Most of it swirls around the room first, creating a permanent haze that stings your eyes and coats everything in soot. This smoke wasn't entirely unwelcome. It helped preserve food hanging from the rafters, drove away some insects, and created a barrier against the cold air trying to seep through every crack and crevice. Medieval people developed a tolerance for smoke that would astonish modern lungs. The alternative was freezing to death in a pristine, smoke-free tomb. You're about to learn the most intimate survival skill in medieval history: strategic body heat distribution. Forget everything you think you know about personal space, because when temperatures plummet to life-threatening levels, modesty becomes a luxury that literally no one can afford. Medieval peasants turned human warmth into a science, and their techniques would make modern efficiency experts jealous. The centerpiece of this thermal strategy was what historians politely call family bedding arrangements, though you'd probably recognize it as the world's first documented cuddle puddle. When night fell and the fire burned low, Thomas's entire household, 8 humans plus assorted livestock, arranged themselves in a carefully orchestrated pattern designed to maximize heat retention. The smallest children nestled between adults like living hot water bottles, while the elderly claimed spots closest to the lingering warmth of the hearth stones. But here's where medieval peasants displayed true genius. They understood that different bodies generate heat at different rates. Pregnant women, with their elevated metabolisms, became prized bed companions, not for romantic reasons, but because they radiated warmth like human furnaces. Young men, with their higher muscle mass and metabolic rates, were strategically positioned as heat anchors around which others could cluster. Even body fat distribution was calculated into these arrangements, with plumper family members serving as insulation buffers against the walls. Medieval people also mastered the art of warming stones, a technique so effective that wealthy households employed entire teams of servants just to manage their heated rock supply. You'd select smooth river stones about the size of your fist, heat them in the fire until they glowed, then wrap them in rags and distribute them throughout the bedding like medieval heating pads. These stones could maintain warmth for hours, and skilled stone warmers knew exactly how hot to make them without causing burns through the thin fabric wrappings. The wealthy had elaborate brass warming pans, long-handled vessels filled with hot coals that were slid between sheets to pre-warm beds. Peasants improvised with clay pots, iron cookware, or even heated bricks wrapped in whatever cloth they could spare. One particularly resourceful technique involved filling pig bladders with hot water, creating the world's first hot water bottles. Though the smell required some getting used to, historians still debate whether medieval people actually slept naked or clothed during winter, but evidence suggests they did whatever generated the most shared warmth. Clothing created barriers between skin and skin, reducing heat transfer efficiency. Yet removing clothes meant losing the insulating air pockets trapped in fabric layers. The solution: strategic partial undressing, where people shed outer garments while keeping undergarments that could trap warm air while still allowing skin contact. Medieval physicians actually prescribed specific warming embraces for treating hypothermia and winter illness. These weren't romantic encounters but medical procedures where healthy individuals would warm dangerously cold patients through sustained skin contact. Monasteries kept detailed records of how many lives were saved through these therapeutic warming sessions, treating body heat like a medication that could be prescribed and administered. The concept of heating the bed before the body became so central to medieval winter survival that it influenced architecture, social customs, and even marriage arrangements. Marriages were sometimes strategically timed for late autumn, not for romantic reasons, but because adding another warm body to the household before winter could mean the difference between survival and death for an entire family. Even clothing was designed with heat sharing in mind. Medieval cloaks were oversized specifically so they could be shared between 2 or more people, and many garments featured ties and clasps that allowed them to be quickly connected to create shared warming cocoons. You're about to discover why medieval people smelled like a walking barnyard, and spoiler alert, it wasn't just poor hygiene. It was a carefully calculated survival strategy that would make your modern shower routine seem absolutely reckless. Welcome to the world of medieval winter clothing, where layers meant life and washing meant death. Thomas begins his morning ritual by checking which clothes have frozen solid overnight. Yes, you read that correctly. In the coldest medieval homes, garments hanging near walls could literally freeze stiff as boards, requiring careful thawing before they could be worn. You're witnessing a daily routine where getting dressed was as much about survival as modesty, and every layer told a story of ingenious adaptation to bone-crushing cold. The foundation of medieval winter wear was the linen undertunic, a long shirt that served as both underwear and base layer. This wasn't the soft, comfortable linen you might imagine, but coarse, scratchy fabric that felt like wearing a hair shirt. Yet this roughness served a purpose. It trapped air between the fibers and created friction against the skin, generating precious micro-warmth through movement. Medieval people understood that smooth fabrics slid against each other, eliminating insulating air pockets, while rough textures created thousands of tiny heat-trapping chambers. Over this base layer, Thomas adds a wool tunic, then another wool garment, then perhaps a third if he's fortunate enough to own multiple pieces. Medieval wool wasn't the processed, soft material you know today. It was often unwashed, still containing natural lanolin that made it water-resistant and helped trap body heat. The smell was legendary. Wet sheep mixed with human sweat would smoke, and the distinctive aroma of wool that had never met soap. Here's where things get interesting from a modern perspective. Medieval people rarely washed their clothes during winter months. This wasn't laziness, it was brilliant survival strategy. Clean clothes had no built-up layer of body oils and natural residues that helped repel water and trap heat. Dirty clothes, paradoxically, were warmer clothes. The accumulated grime, body oils, and even lice created an ecosystem that actually improved the garment's insulating properties. Speaking of lice, these tiny creatures were so ubiquitous in medieval clothing that people had specialized ivory combs just for managing their populations. But here's a fact that might surprise you. Lice actually generated their own microscopic amounts of body heat through their metabolic processes. Medieval people understood this on some level, tolerating their unwelcome tenants partly because a lice-free person was often a colder person. The outer layer consisted of a thick woolen cloak, often treated with animal fat or beeswax to provide water resistance. These cloaks were massive, sometimes weighing 20 pounds or more when fully saturated with natural oils and accumulated wear. They doubled as blankets, ground covers, and emergency shelters, with many featuring hoods so large they could completely enclose the wearer's head and shoulders. Medieval people also practiced strategic layering of different textile weights and weaves. Loose weaves against the skin allowed moisture to escape while trapping air, while tighter weaves on outer layers blocked wind and precipitation. This wasn't accidental. Generations of trial and error had taught medieval people exactly how to stack different fabric types for maximum thermal efficiency. Historians still argue whether medieval people wore anything resembling modern underwear, but evidence suggests that both men and women wore linen braids, loose drawers tied at the waist. These served multiple functions. They protected valuable outer garments from body soil, provided an extra insulation layer around the core, and could be washed more easily than complex outer garments. Footwear deserves special mention because frozen feet meant death, plain and simple. Medieval boots were often stuffed with straw, moss, or animal fur, creating insulation that was replaced regularly as it became compressed or wet. Wealthy peasants might afford leather boots, but most made do with wrapped cloth or wooden clogs that kept feet elevated above frozen ground. You're crouched beside Thomas as he carefully feeds kindling to the dying embers in his hearth, and you can feel the weight of absolute responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. This isn't just about comfort. If this fire dies completely during the night, his family might not see morning. Welcome to medieval fire management, where every spark was precious and every flame was literally a matter of life and death. The medieval hearth wasn't designed for convenience. It was engineered for survival through months of brutal cold. Thomas begins his fire ritual hours before sunset, banking coals with a technique passed down through generations. He's creating what medieval people called a slumbering fire, a carefully constructed arrangement of coals, ash, and greenwood that would smolder through the night without bursting into dangerous flames or dying completely. You watch as Thomas selects his materials with the precision of a pharmacist mixing medicine. The base layer consists of hardwood coals from oak or beech, dense woods that burn slowly and produce sustained heat. Over these, he places slightly damp logs that will smolder rather than flame, releasing heat gradually throughout the night. The top layer consists of ash and earth, creating an insulating blanket that controls the fire's oxygen supply like a medieval thermostat. But here's where medieval fire management becomes genuinely dangerous. One wrong calculation meant either freezing to death or burning alive. Medieval homes were essentially giant tinderboxes constructed from straw, wood, and dried mud. A fire that burned too hot could ignite the thatched roof within minutes, while a fire that died meant hypothermia before dawn. Thomas walks this tightrope every single night for 6 months of the year. Medieval people developed an arsenal of fire-starting techniques that would impress modern survivalists. They carried char cloth, cotton fabric that had been partially burned and sealed in containers, creating material that would catch sparks instantly. They maintained supplies of birch bark, which contains natural oils that burn even when damp. Most importantly, they never, ever let their fires die completely if they could help it. The most ingenious fire preservation technique was the fire pot, a specially designed clay vessel with air holes that could house glowing coals for transport or overnight storage. Medieval families often shared fire pots with neighbors, creating networks of backup heat sources throughout entire villages. If one family's fire died, they could rekindle it from a neighbor's pot, maintaining community warmth through cooperation. Medieval people also understood something modern fire enthusiasts often miss. Different woods produce different types of heat. Softwoods like pine burned quickly and produced cheerful flames but little lasting warmth. Hardwoods like oak burned slowly with intense heat but were harder to ignite. Fruit woods like apple or cherry produced pleasant aromas that helped combat the smell of unwashed bodies and animal waste. Thomas chooses his wood combinations based on specific nighttime needs: quick heat for cooking dinner, sustained warmth for sleeping, aromatic smoke for psychological comfort. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually understood the science behind combustion, but their practical knowledge was extraordinary. They knew that wet wood produced more smoke, useful for food preservation, that certain bark types helped maintain steady temperatures, and that positioning fires near stone walls created thermal masses that radiated heat long after flames died down. The dangers were constantly present and absolutely terrifying. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of entire families perishing in house fires started by poorly managed hearths. Children regularly suffered severe burns from sleeping too close to open flames. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires killed silently, with victims simply failing to wake up on winter mornings. Yet medieval people also developed sophisticated safety measures. They created fire breaks around their homes by clearing vegetation, built stone barriers around hearths to contain sparks, and appointed family members to take turns monitoring fires throughout the night. The responsibility rotated among household members, ensuring someone always remained alert to potential dangers. Fire maintenance required constant fuel supplies, and gathering winter firewood was a community effort that began in summer. Medieval villages operated complex systems for allocating wood resources, with strict rules governing who could gather what types of fuel from which forest areas. You're crouched beside Thomas as he carefully feeds kindling to the dying embers in his hearth, and you can feel the weight of absolute responsibility pressing down on his shoulders. This isn't just about comfort. If this fire dies completely during the night, his family might not see morning. Welcome to medieval fire management, where every spark was precious and every flame was literally a matter of life and death. The medieval hearth wasn't designed for convenience. It was engineered for survival through months of brutal cold. Thomas begins his fire ritual hours before sunset, banking coals with a technique passed down through generations. He's creating what medieval people called a slumbering fire, a carefully constructed arrangement of coals, ash, and greenwood that would smolder through the night without bursting into dangerous flames or dying completely. You watch as Thomas selects his materials with the precision of a pharmacist mixing medicine. The base layer consists of hardwood coals from oak or beech, dense woods that burn slowly and produce sustained heat. Over these, he places slightly damp logs that will smolder rather than flame, releasing heat gradually throughout the night. The top layer consists of ash and earth, creating an insulating blanket that controls the fire's oxygen supply like a medieval thermostat. But here's where medieval fire management becomes genuinely dangerous. One wrong calculation meant either freezing to death or burning alive. Medieval homes were essentially giant tinderboxes constructed from straw, wood, and dried mud. A fire that burned too hot could ignite the thatched roof within minutes, while a fire that died meant hypothermia before dawn. Thomas walks this tightrope every single night for 6 months of the year. Medieval people developed an arsenal of fire-starting techniques that would impress modern survivalists. They carried char cloth, cotton fabric that had been partially burned and sealed in containers, creating material that would catch sparks instantly. They maintained supplies of birch bark, which contains natural oils that burn even when damp. Most importantly, they never, ever let their fires die completely if they could help it. The most ingenious fire preservation technique was the fire pot, a specially designed clay vessel with air holes that could house glowing coals for transport or overnight storage. Medieval families often shared fire pots with neighbors, creating networks of backup heat sources throughout entire villages. If one family's fire died, they could rekindle it from a neighbor's pot, maintaining community warmth through cooperation. Medieval people also understood something modern fire enthusiasts often miss. Different woods produce different types of heat. Softwoods like pine burned quickly and produced cheerful flames but little lasting warmth. Hardwoods like oak burned slowly with intense heat but were harder to ignite. Fruit woods like apple or cherry produced pleasant aromas that helped combat the smell of unwashed bodies and animal waste. Thomas chooses his wood combinations based on specific nighttime needs: quick heat for cooking dinner, sustained warmth for sleeping, aromatic smoke for psychological comfort. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually understood the science behind combustion, but their practical knowledge was extraordinary. They knew that wet wood produced more smoke, useful for food preservation, that certain bark types helped maintain steady temperatures, and that positioning fires near stone walls created thermal masses that radiated heat long after flames died down. The dangers were constantly present and absolutely terrifying. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of entire families perishing in house fires started by poorly managed hearths. Children regularly suffered severe burns from sleeping too close to open flames. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires killed silently, with victims simply failing to wake up on winter mornings. Yet medieval people also developed sophisticated safety measures. They created fire breaks around their homes by clearing vegetation, built stone barriers around hearths to contain sparks, and appointed family members to take turns monitoring fires throughout the night. The responsibility rotated among household members, ensuring someone always remained alert to potential dangers. Fire maintenance required constant fuel supplies, and gathering winter firewood was a community effort that began in summer. Medieval villages operated complex systems for allocating wood resources, with strict rules governing who could gather what types of fuel from which forest areas. You're watching Margaret stir a steaming pot over the hearth, and the aroma rising from that blackened cauldron tells a story of medieval ingenuity that would surprise any modern coffee shop barista. This isn't just about quenching thirst. These hot drinks were liquid survival, providing calories, warmth, and psychological comfort during the endless dark months when hope felt as frozen as the ground outside. The cornerstone of medieval winter drinking was ale, but not the crisp, clear beer you might imagine. Medieval ale was thick, nutritious, and often consumed warm with spices added for both flavor and medicinal properties. Margaret heats her family's morning ale in an iron pot, adding honey when available, herbs from her summer garden, and sometimes beaten eggs to create what was essentially liquid breakfast. This warm ale provided carbohydrates, B vitamins, and enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria in questionable water sources. But here's where medieval beverage science gets genuinely sophisticated. Different hot drinks served different survival functions. Mulled wine was reserved for special occasions and illness, not because of cost alone, but because medieval people understood that alcohol could be both helpful and dangerous in extreme cold. Too much impaired judgment needed for fire management and warmth conservation, while too little failed to provide the circulatory benefits that helped combat frostbite. Medieval people created dozens of herbal teas from plants they gathered and dried during warmer months. Chamomile tea soothed winter anxiety and promoted sleep during long, dark nights. Nettle tea provided iron and vitamins that prevented scurvy when fresh vegetables disappeared. Pine needle tea, yes, actual pine needles, delivered vitamin C and helped combat the respiratory infections that killed so many during winter months. Medieval people didn't understand vitamins, but they knew these teas kept families healthier. The preparation of hot drinks required constant attention and precious fuel, making every cup a small luxury. Margaret shows you how to heat stones in the fire, then drop them into wooden vessels to warm liquids without wasting firewood on maintaining cooking fires. This technique, called stone boiling, allowed medieval people to prepare hot drinks using minimal fuel while avoiding the risk of burning precious wooden containers. Medieval monasteries developed the most sophisticated hot beverage traditions, creating warming drinks that bordered on the medicinal. Monastery brewers understood that certain herb combinations not only tasted pleasant but actually improved winter health. They documented recipes for warming drinks that included ginger for circulation, cinnamon for blood sugar regulation, and cloves for their antiseptic properties. These weren't just random flavor combinations. They were carefully crafted health tonics disguised as comfort beverages. The most ingenious medieval hot drink was called posset, a mixture of hot milk, ale or wine, and spices that created a warm, nourishing beverage that provided both immediate heat and sustained energy. The alcohol would partially curdle the milk, creating a drink with the consistency of thin pudding that filled stomachs while warming bodies from the inside out. Wealthy households served posset in specialized silver bowls that retained heat, while peasants made do with wooden vessels that required constant reheating. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually enjoyed these beverages or simply endured them for survival, but evidence suggests that hot drinks became genuinely important for psychological well-being. The ritual of preparing and sharing warm beverages provided structure to long winter days while creating moments of comfort that helped families cope with isolation and hardship. Medieval people also understood the importance of timing their hot drink consumption. Morning beverages provided energy for daily work, while evening drinks promoted sleep and helped bodies prepare for cold nights. They knew that consuming very hot liquids before going outside could cause dangerous temperature shocks, while drinking cold liquids during winter could lower body temperature to dangerous levels. The social aspect of hot beverages was equally crucial for winter survival. Sharing drinks created opportunities for families to gather around the fire, tell stories, and maintain social bonds that helped combat the depression and isolation that killed as many medieval people as cold or hunger. These weren't just beverages, they were liquid community, providing warmth that went far beyond simple temperature. You're witnessing something that would make modern disaster preparedness experts weep with envy. An entire medieval village transforming into a single, coordinated survival organism as winter's grip tightens. Forget rugged individualism. Medieval people understood that shared resources and collective warmth were the only things standing between their community and complete annihilation by cold. The village warming house stands at the center of this cooperative survival strategy. This large, communal building, often the only structure with a proper stone fireplace, becomes the beating heart of winter community life. You watch as families take turns contributing fuel to the central fire, creating a rotation system that ensures warmth is always available while distributing the enormous cost of heating a large space. Thomas brings his family here 3 evenings per week, not just for warmth, but for the psychological salvation of human contact during months when isolation could drive people genuinely insane. Medieval villages developed intricate resource-sharing networks that would impress modern economists. The warming circle system meant that families with better insulation or fuel supplies took in neighbors whose homes couldn't maintain safe temperatures. These weren't acts of charity. They were calculated survival strategies where helping others directly improved your own family's chances of surviving until spring. A neighbor who froze to death couldn't help with spring planting, community defense, or sharing their specialized skills. You discover that medieval people invented communal cooking on a scale that makes modern potluck dinners look amateur. Large pots of stew or pottage were prepared using contributions from multiple families, creating meals that provided better nutrition and warmth efficiency than individual family cooking. These communal meals used less fuel per person while ensuring that families with limited food supplies didn't starve. The village baker's oven, fired only twice per week to conserve fuel, became a community resource where multiple families brought their bread dough, meat pies, and roasts to cook simultaneously. Medieval children were incorporated into these survival networks through what historians call winter apprenticeships. Children from larger families were temporarily placed with smaller households, not as servants, but as additional body heat sources and extra hands for survival tasks. This distributed child rearing reduced the burden on struggling families while ensuring no child went without adequate warmth or food. It also created community bonds that lasted lifetimes and strengthened village resilience. The most ingenious community survival strategy was the night watch system. Village families took turns maintaining fires in the communal warming house throughout the night, ensuring that anyone experiencing a household emergency, a dead fire, sudden illness, or structural collapse, had a warm refuge available immediately. These night watchers also served as early warning systems for fires, medical emergencies, or other disasters that could threaten the entire community. Historians still argue whether medieval villages actually functioned as harmoniously as some records suggest, but survival necessity created cooperation that transcended normal social conflicts. Families that might argue over property boundaries during summer put aside differences to share warmth and resources during winter. The threat of death was so immediate and universal that petty disputes became literally unaffordable luxuries. Medieval communities also developed sophisticated information-sharing networks about winter survival techniques. Knowledge about weather prediction, food preservation, medical treatments, and warming strategies was communally owned rather than hoarded. An innovation that helped one family survive winter was quickly shared throughout the village because everyone's survival depended on collective success. The psychological support systems that medieval villages created were just as important as physical warmth sharing. Storytelling circles, communal prayers, and group singing provided mental health support that helped people cope with seasonal depression, claustrophobia, and the constant stress of survival. These gatherings weren't entertainment. They were therapeutic interventions that prevented the psychological breakdown that could doom entire families. Medieval villages even coordinated their clothing resources through lending and sharing systems. A family with extra cloaks would lend them to neighbors whose children had outgrown their winter gear. Tools for clothing maintenance, needles, thread, patches, were community resources that circulated based on need rather than ownership. Everyone understood that a neighbor whose children froze to death would be psychologically destroyed and economically useless to the community. You're about to discover why medieval peasants willingly shared their homes with creatures that modern health inspectors would classify as livestock violations. Welcome to the medieval barnyard bedroom, where cows, pigs, chickens, and goats weren't just farm animals. They were four-legged furnaces that generated the difference between life and death during winter's cruelest months. Thomas opens the door to show you Brunhild the sow in all her glory, and you immediately understand why she's earned a place of honor inside the family home. This massive pig generates approximately the same amount of body heat as 3 adult humans, radiating warmth at a steady rate throughout the night. Unlike humans, who cool down during sleep, pigs maintain consistent body temperatures, making them ideal bed-warmer companions. Medieval people positioned pig stalls strategically near sleeping areas, creating natural heating systems that required no fuel and produced their own fertilizer. But pigs were just the beginning of medieval animal heating technology. Dairy cows, when brought indoors during the coldest months, generated enough warmth to heat spaces equivalent to modern baseboard heaters. A single cow produces about 1,500 BTUs per hour through normal metabolic processes, enough to noticeably warm a small medieval dwelling. The added benefit was fresh milk during winter months when most food sources were preserved or dried, providing crucial nutrition when fresh options disappeared. Medieval people understood that different animals served different heating functions. Chickens, with their rapid metabolisms and constant movement, generated quick bursts of heat while providing fresh eggs throughout winter. Roosters were particularly valued because their territorial behavior kept them active even in cold weather, maintaining higher heat output than more sedentary birds. A flock of chickens could raise the temperature in a small room by several degrees while providing protein through eggs when other fresh foods weren't available. Goats earned their place in medieval homes through their remarkable ability to generate heat while requiring minimal feed. These hardy animals could survive on scraps, hay, and even paper if necessary, while producing milk, warmth, and eventually meat. Medieval people discovered that goats actually prefer close contact with humans and other animals during cold weather, making them willing participants in communal warming arrangements. Their body temperature runs higher than human temperature, making them excellent natural heaters. The science behind animal heating was more sophisticated than you might expect. Medieval people understood that animals with higher metabolic rates generated more heat, which is why young animals were often preferred as heating companions. They knew that well-fed animals produced more warmth than hungry ones, leading to careful feeding schedules designed to maximize heat production during the coldest parts of night. They even understood that pregnant animals generated additional heat, making expectant mothers particularly valuable during winter months. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly grasped the scientific principles behind animal heat generation, but their practical application was brilliant. They positioned animals to create heat zones throughout their homes, with the warmest animals closest to sleeping areas and cooler animals near storage spaces that needed protection from freezing but didn't require maximum warmth. The challenges of indoor animal management were significant and genuinely disgusting by modern standards. Medieval homes required constant cleaning to manage animal waste, sophisticated ventilation to prevent dangerous gas buildup, and careful disease management to prevent illnesses from spreading between animals and humans. Medieval people developed complex protocols for monitoring animal health, understanding that a sick animal could become a liability rather than an asset. Medieval animals were also trained for specific heating behaviors. Dogs were taught to lie still against human bodies for maximum heat transfer. Cats were encouraged to sleep on people's chests, where their purring created additional warmth vibrations. Even rabbits were used as portable heating pads, tucked inside clothing or bedding, where their rapid heartbeats and warm fur provided localized heating. The social hierarchy of medieval heating animals was complex and fascinating. The most valuable heat-producing animals received the best treatment, premium feeding, and prime positioning within homes. Families invested significant resources in maintaining their heating animals because losing them meant facing winter without crucial warmth sources. These animals weren't pets in the modern sense. They were essential survival equipment that happened to be alive. You're settling into Thomas's bed for the night, and if you expected anything resembling modern comfort, prepare for a shock that'll keep you awake longer than any medieval lullaby. This isn't sleeping. It's an elaborate survival ritual that transforms the simple act of lying down into a complex choreography of warmth conservation, safety protocols, and shared body heat management that could mean the difference between waking up and becoming a winter casualty. The medieval bed itself challenges every assumption you have about furniture. What you're looking at isn't really a bed at all, but rather a carefully constructed heat retention system disguised as sleeping arrangements. The base consists of a wooden frame raised several inches off the ground, not for comfort, but to create insulation from the frozen earth that could literally suck warmth from sleeping bodies. Medieval people understood that ground contact during winter meant death, so every sleeping surface was elevated and layered with materials designed to trap heat. Your mattress for tonight is a canvas sack stuffed with straw, hay, or if the family is particularly prosperous, sheep's wool. This isn't the supportive, cushioned surface you know, but rather a lumpy, scratchy collection of organic materials that serves one primary purpose: creating thousands of tiny air pockets that trap body heat. The straw mattress is actually brilliant medieval technology. It provides insulation from below while conforming to body shapes that maximize heat retention between multiple sleepers. Medieval bedding was an exercise in layering that would impress modern outdoor enthusiasts. The bottom layer consists of coarse woolen blankets that trap air while wicking moisture away from bodies. Over this go layers of linen sheets, when families could afford them, that provide a barrier between skin and scratchy wool while creating additional insulating air spaces. The top layer features heavy woolen coverlets, often shared between multiple family members, that seal in the warmth generated by the complex layering system below. But here's where medieval sleep science gets genuinely sophisticated. The positioning strategies that families develop to maximize shared warmth. You're not just lying down. You're becoming part of a carefully orchestrated heat-sharing formation. Adults sleep on the outside edges where their larger body mass can shield children and elderly family members from cold drafts. Pregnant women, with their elevated body temperatures, are positioned as heat anchors around which others can cluster. Even the family dog has a designated spot calculated to provide maximum warmth distribution. Medieval people understood that different sleep positions affected heat retention in ways that modern people rarely consider. Sleeping curled in fetal positions reduced surface area exposed to cold air while keeping vital organs warm. Spooning wasn't romantic, it was thermal engineering, with family members arranged to create overlapping heat zones that eliminated cold gaps between bodies. Arms and legs were positioned to trap warm air while preventing heat loss through extremities. The pre-sleep warming ritual was as important as the sleep itself. Hot stones, heated in the fire and wrapped in cloth, were distributed throughout the bedding like medieval heating pads. Clay pots filled with hot water served as foot warmers, positioned at the bottom of the bed, where they could warm the entire sleeping area through radiant heat. Some families used heated bricks wrapped in wool, creating thermal masses that retained warmth for hours. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually slept through entire nights or simply dozed in shifts while monitoring fires and maintaining warmth, but evidence suggests that successful winter sleeping required constant vigilance. Family members took turns checking on fires, adjusting bedding, and ensuring that everyone remained adequately warm throughout the night. Medieval sleep safety protocols were elaborate and absolutely necessary. Bedding had to be positioned far enough from open fires to prevent accidental ignition, but close enough to benefit from radiant heat. Ventilation had to be managed to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning from indoor fires while maintaining enough air circulation to prevent suffocation under heavy blankets. Children were positioned between adults not just for warmth, but to prevent them from wandering toward dangerous fires during sleep. The psychological aspect of medieval sleep was equally complex. Families developed bedtime rituals designed to promote sleep despite uncomfortable conditions, constant cold, and legitimate fears about surviving until morning. These included storytelling, prayers, and communal songs that helped people relax despite the physical and emotional stresses of winter survival. You wake to the sound of Thomas stirring in the pre-dawn darkness, and you realize that medieval winter days weren't just shorter. They were completely reorganized around survival rhythms that modern people can barely comprehend. Welcome to a world where daylight was so precious that every moment of natural light was choreographed like a ballet, and nighttime activities were planned with the precision of military operations. Medieval peasants divided their winter days into segments that had nothing to do with clocks and everything to do with survival priorities. The first segment, beginning before sunrise, was dedicated to what they called fire tending, the critical process of reviving overnight fires, checking on preserved foods, and ensuring that no family member had succumbed to cold during the night. Thomas moves through this routine with practiced efficiency, his movements choreographed by years of repetition and the constant awareness that mistakes could be fatal. But here's where medieval time management becomes genuinely brilliant. They understood that different tasks required different types of warmth and energy. Heavy physical work like chopping wood, hauling water, or tending animals was scheduled during the coldest parts of day because vigorous activity generated body heat that offset freezing temperatures. Sedentary activities like mending clothes, preparing food, or maintaining tools were saved for times when families could gather around fires, sharing heat while accomplishing necessary work. Medieval people developed sophisticated indoor work rotations that maximized both productivity and warmth conservation. Women's work, spinning, weaving, sewing, and food preparation was organized around communal fires where multiple family members could share heat while contributing to household survival. Men's indoor work focused on tool maintenance, weapon care, and planning for spring activities, tasks that could be accomplished in brief bursts between outdoor duties. The concept of productive rest was central to medieval winter survival. Unlike modern leisure time, medieval rest periods were carefully planned activities that conserved energy while accomplishing necessary tasks. Storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was cultural education that transmitted survival knowledge to children while keeping families mentally engaged during long, dark hours. Singing served similar functions, providing psychological comfort while requiring no physical exertion that would burn precious calories. Medieval people also understood seasonal psychology in ways that modern people are just beginning to rediscover. They knew that reduced daylight caused what we now call seasonal depression, and they developed countermeasures that were surprisingly sophisticated. Communal activities were scheduled to combat isolation, while individual tasks were designed to provide sense of accomplishment during months when survival itself was the primary achievement. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually worked less during winter or simply redistributed their labor differently. But evidence suggests that winter work was more intense and focused than summer activities. Every task had to be evaluated for its survival value, with non-essential activities postponed until spring when energy and resources could be spared for less critical pursuits. The indoor crafts that medieval people pursued during winter months were chosen for their dual benefits. They provided necessary goods while generating small amounts of body heat through physical activity. Spinning wool required constant hand and finger movement that improved circulation. Weaving involved arm and shoulder movements that generated warmth while producing essential textiles. Even carving and woodworking were valued partly because they kept hands active and warm while creating useful tools. Medieval children's winter activities were carefully structured to balance education, entertainment, and heat generation. Children were taught adult skills through games that required physical movement, keeping their small bodies warm while preparing them for future survival responsibilities. Play was often communal and designed to keep multiple children active simultaneously, maximizing both heat generation and social bonding. The evening transition from work to sleep was perhaps the most critical part of medieval daily rhythms. This wasn't simply stopping work. It was a complex process of securing homes against night dangers, banking fires for overnight survival, distributing heated stones for warmth, and organizing family sleeping arrangements for maximum heat sharing. These evening rituals could take hours and required coordination between all family members. Medieval people also developed seasonal work cycles that prepared for winter throughout the entire year. Summer and autumn work was organized around creating winter supplies, improving home insulation, and stockpiling materials needed for cold weather survival. Winter work focused on conservation, conserving energy, heat, food, and resources while maintaining essential activities needed for immediate survival. You're watching Margaret brew a concoction that looks suspiciously like muddy water mixed with questionable herbs, and you're about to discover that medieval medicine during winter months was equal parts desperation, folk wisdom, and treatments that would either cure you or finish what the cold started. Welcome to the world of medieval winter healthcare, where staying healthy meant relying on remedies that ranged from surprisingly effective to absolutely terrifying. Medieval people understood that winter sickness was different from summer ailments, deadlier, more persistent, and requiring treatments that addressed both physical symptoms and the underlying challenge of maintaining body heat while fighting illness. The most common winter killer was what they called lung fever, pneumonia that developed from constant exposure to cold, damp conditions, and weakened immune systems struggling with malnutrition and stress. Margaret's currant brew contains willow bark, which modern people know contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry, but they knew willow bark tea reduced fever and eased the joint pain that accompanied winter illnesses. This wasn't accidental knowledge. Generations of trial and error had identified dozens of plants that genuinely helped combat winter sickness, creating a pharmacological tradition that modern medicine is still discovering. But medieval winter medicine went far beyond herbal teas. The most important treatment for winter illness was heat therapy, applied with techniques that would make modern spa treatments look primitive. Medieval people created sweat lodges using heated stones and enclosed spaces, generating therapeutic steam that helped clear respiratory infections while raising body temperatures to levels that killed harmful bacteria. These weren't luxury treatments. They were medical interventions that saved lives. Medieval people also practiced what we now recognize as aromatherapy, burning specific herbs and plants to create medicinal smoke that was believed to purify air and treat respiratory ailments. Rosemary, thyme, and sage were burned not just for pleasant scents, but because medieval people had observed that these smoke treatments seemed to help people recover from winter coughs and breathing difficulties. Modern science has confirmed that many of these plants contain compounds with genuine antimicrobial properties. The most sophisticated medieval winter medicine involved dietary treatments that addressed the nutritional deficiencies that made people vulnerable to illness. Medieval physicians understood that certain foods helped maintain health during winter months, prescribing specific diets that included preserved fruits for what we now know was vitamin C deficiency, fermented dairy products for digestive health, and iron-rich foods like liver and blood sausage for what they called winter weakness. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly understood the connection between nutrition and illness prevention, but their practical knowledge was remarkable. They knew that people who ate certain food combinations stayed healthier during winter months, that pregnant women required special diets to survive cold seasons, and that children needed different nutrition than adults to maintain their body heat and growth during months of limited food variety. Medieval wound care during winter presented unique challenges that required ingenious solutions. Cuts and injuries that would heal easily in warm weather became life-threatening during winter months, when reduced circulation and compromised immune systems turned minor problems into major crises. Medieval people developed wound treatments using honey, which we now know has genuine antibiotic properties, combined with heated cloth applications that promoted healing while preventing dangerous infections. The psychological treatments for winter illness were equally important and surprisingly sophisticated. Medieval people recognized that what we now call seasonal depression was a genuine medical condition that required intervention. They prescribed specific activities, social interactions, and even light therapy techniques that helped people cope with the mental health challenges of surviving long, dark winters. Music therapy, storytelling, and communal prayers weren't just entertainment. They were medical treatments for psychological ailments. Medieval people also developed complex protocols for managing contagious illnesses during winter months when families were confined together in small spaces. They understood quarantine principles, isolation techniques, and air purification methods that prevented single illnesses from destroying entire households. These weren't based on modern germ theory, but on practical observations about how sickness spread and what interventions seemed to prevent epidemic disasters. The most dangerous aspect of medieval winter medicine was the treatments that were genuinely harmful but seemed logical given their understanding of illness. Bloodletting during winter months often weakened already struggling patients, while some herbal treatments contained compounds that were toxic in the doses medieval people used. Yet even these dangerous treatments sometimes helped through placebo effects or by addressing secondary symptoms that made patients feel better even when the underlying illness remained. You're gathered around the hearth with Thomas's family as darkness settles over the village like a suffocating blanket, and you're about to discover that medieval people didn't just survive winter's physical challenges. They created elaborate social rituals that provided the psychological warmth necessary to prevent communities from collapsing under the weight of isolation, fear, and endless cold. Welcome to the medieval art of turning human contact into a survival strategy. The storytelling circle that forms around you isn't casual entertainment. It's a sophisticated psychological intervention designed to combat the mental health crisis that claimed as many medieval lives as hypothermia or starvation. Medieval people understood that the human mind, confined for months in cramped, dark spaces with the same people, could break down in ways that destroyed entire families. These evening gatherings served as group therapy sessions disguised as folk tradition, providing structured social interaction that maintained community mental health. Margaret begins tonight's story with a tale you've heard variations of before, a hero's journey through seemingly impossible challenges, culminating in triumph over adversity. This isn't coincidence. Medieval storytelling followed psychological patterns that modern therapists would recognize as cognitive behavioral therapy. These stories reinforced messages about endurance, hope, and the rewards that waited for those who survived current hardships. Every tale was carefully chosen to provide exactly the mental reinforcement that winter-stressed minds needed to continue functioning. The communal singing that follows storytelling serves multiple therapeutic functions that medieval people understood intuitively. Group singing requires coordinated breathing, which naturally reduces anxiety and creates physiological calm. The vibrations from multiple voices create physical sensations that combat the numbness and disconnection that resulted from months of survival-focused living. Most importantly, singing together created feelings of unity and shared purpose that helped individuals remember they weren't facing winter's challenges alone. Medieval people developed elaborate games and activities specifically designed for winter mental health maintenance. These weren't random amusements, but carefully structured interactions that addressed specific psychological needs. Riddle contests exercised minds that were becoming dull from limited stimulation. Memory games helped maintain cognitive function during months when mental challenges were scarce. Even simple hand games provided opportunities for human touch that was essential for psychological well-being. The most sophisticated aspect of medieval social warmth was the rotation system that ensured no individual became isolated or overwhelmed by community responsibilities. Families took turns hosting gatherings, sharing the burden of providing space, fuel, and food for communal activities. This rotation prevented any single household from bearing unsustainable costs while ensuring that social interactions continued even when resources were stretched thin. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously understood the psychological benefits of their social rituals, but the evidence suggests remarkable sophistication in community mental health management. Villages developed early warning systems for identifying individuals who were struggling with winter depression, intervention strategies for helping families in crisis, and support networks that prevented individual breakdowns from destroying community stability. Medieval children received special attention during these social gatherings because adults understood that young minds were particularly vulnerable to winter's psychological challenges. Children were given specific roles in storytelling, singing, and games that made them feel valuable to community survival while providing the mental stimulation necessary for healthy development. These weren't just activities to keep children busy. They were educational programs designed to prepare young minds for adult survival responsibilities. The religious aspects of medieval winter gatherings served psychological functions that transcended spiritual beliefs. Prayer sessions provided structured meditation that helped reduce anxiety and promote mental calm. Religious storytelling reinforced messages about meaning and purpose that helped individuals cope with the seemingly endless struggle of winter survival. Even for people who weren't deeply religious, these spiritual activities provided psychological anchors that prevented despair from overwhelming rational thought. Medieval communities also developed sophisticated conflict resolution systems specifically for winter months when interpersonal tensions could explode into violence that destroyed families and communities. These social gatherings provided neutral spaces where disputes could be aired, mediated, and resolved before they escalated into dangerous conflicts. Community leaders were trained to recognize the signs of winter stress and intervene before psychological pressures led to physical violence. The physical contact that occurred during these social gatherings was carefully managed to provide therapeutic human touch while respecting medieval social boundaries. Communal dancing, group prayers, and shared work activities provided opportunities for appropriate physical contact that helped combat the isolation and numbness that resulted from months of survival-focused living. You're standing beside Thomas in the pre-dawn darkness of late February, and there's something different in the air. Not warmth exactly, but a subtle shift that makes your medieval-trained senses prick with anticipation. After months of survival that have felt like an eternity, you're about to witness the most crucial skill in medieval winter endurance. Recognizing the first whispered promises of spring, while still maintaining the vigilance that has kept your family alive through winter's cruelest months. The signs are almost imperceptible to modern eyes, but Thomas reads them like a survival manual written in nature's most subtle language. The morning frost takes 15 minutes longer to form than it did in January. The wind carries a different scent. Not the sterile, knife-sharp smell of deep winter, but something that hints at Earth awakening beneath layers of snow and ice. Even the smoke from the village chimneys behaves differently, rising straighter in air that's beginning to lose winter's crushing weight. Medieval people developed an almost supernatural ability to detect seasonal transitions because their lives depended on making critical decisions about resource allocation, food rationing, and survival strategies based on accurate predictions about winter's duration. Getting these calculations wrong meant either starving before spring arrived or wasting precious resources on unnecessary caution. Thomas demonstrates the skill by showing you how to read the behavior of animals, the patterns of ice formation, and even the quality of light that filtered through their single oilcloth window. But here's where medieval spring anticipation becomes genuinely complex. The psychological challenge of maintaining hope without allowing premature optimism to destroy survival discipline. Medieval people understood that false springs could be deadlier than the worst winter storms because they tempted families to reduce their guard, consume stored food too quickly, or make decisions based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of remaining challenges. The most dangerous period in medieval winter survival was often these final weeks when spring seemed possible but wasn't yet certain. Families had to balance conserving their remaining resources against the psychological need for hope and celebration. Too much caution meant missing opportunities to improve their situation, while too little meant potential disaster if winter returned with renewed fury. Medieval people developed sophisticated decision-making protocols for managing this delicate balance. Medieval communities created elaborate spring prediction systems that combined weather observation, animal behavior analysis, and traditional knowledge passed down through generations. Village elders were consulted for their memories of previous spring timings, while hunters reported on wildlife behavior that indicated seasonal changes. Farmers examined soil conditions and plant growth patterns for signs of seasonal transition. These weren't casual observations. They were scientific data collection efforts that informed community survival strategies. Historians still argue whether medieval people actually possessed superior weather prediction abilities or simply developed better observation skills through necessity, but their practical knowledge was remarkable. They could predict late-season storms, identify false spring warming periods, and estimate with surprising accuracy how many more weeks of winter survival their communities needed to endure. The anticipation of spring also triggered complex emotional responses that medieval people had to manage carefully. After months of survival-focused thinking, the possibility of relief created psychological vulnerabilities that could lead to dangerous decision-making. Medieval people developed mental preparation techniques for transitioning from winter survival mode to spring planning mode, understanding that this psychological shift required as much skill as any physical survival technique. Medieval families used spring anticipation as motivation for enduring the final, often most difficult weeks of winter. They planned spring activities, discussed summer goals, and made preparations for seasonal transitions that helped maintain morale during the period when resources were most depleted and spirits were lowest. These weren't just pleasant fantasies. They were psychological survival tools that provided mental strength for completing winter's challenges. The most sophisticated aspect of medieval spring preparation was the gradual transition from pure survival mode to recovery and rebuilding mode. Families had to begin planning for spring planting, house repairs, and community rebuilding, while still maintaining the vigilance necessary for surviving potential late-season disasters. This required remarkable mental flexibility and strategic thinking that balanced current needs against future opportunities. Medieval people also understood that surviving winter was only half the challenge. Recovering from winter's physical and psychological damage required careful management that could determine whether families thrived or merely existed during the warmer months ahead. Spring preparation included planning for nutrition recovery, physical rehabilitation, and psychological healing that would restore individuals and communities to full functionality. You're standing with Thomas on a morning in early March when the impossible finally happens. A single drop of water falls from an icicle hanging beneath his roof's edge. It's just one drop, barely visible. But after 6 months of winter survival that have tested every limit of human endurance, this tiny liquid miracle represents something that no amount of modern comfort can replicate. The profound, life-affirming triumph of having conquered death itself through nothing but human ingenuity, cooperation, and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The medieval celebration of surviving winter wasn't a party. It was a resurrection ceremony for people who had literally walked through the valley of death and emerged intact on the other side. Thomas's family gathers around their hearth, not to feast, because their food stores are nearly depleted, but to acknowledge that they have accomplished something extraordinary. They have faced down the most lethal season in human history using techniques that were ancient when Rome was young, and they have won. Medieval people understood that surviving winter created a bond between individuals and communities that transcended normal human relationships. You had shared body heat with people during nights when privacy was a luxury that could kill. You had made decisions about food distribution that determined who lived and who died. You had maintained fires that were literally the difference between life and death for everyone you loved. These weren't casual experiences. They were transformative ordeals that created what we might now call post-traumatic growth. The skills that medieval people developed during winter survival changed them in ways that extended far beyond cold weather endurance. They learned to read subtle environmental signs that warned of danger or opportunity. They developed psychological resilience that helped them cope with challenges that would overwhelm people who hadn't faced similar trials. They created social bonds based on shared survival that were stronger than blood relationships formed under normal circumstances. But perhaps most importantly, medieval people who survived winter gained a perspective on life that modern people struggle to understand. They knew, with bone-deep certainty, that they were capable of enduring almost unimaginable hardship and emerging stronger. They understood that comfort was temporary, that security was an illusion, but that human beings possessed inner resources that could overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The legacy of medieval winter survival extends far beyond historical curiosity. These people developed techniques for resource conservation, community cooperation, and psychological resilience that modern society has largely forgotten. They understood that survival required balancing individual needs against community welfare, that hoarding resources ultimately weakened everyone, and that helping others was often the most effective way to help yourself. Medieval winter survivors also developed a relationship with discomfort that modern people might find instructive. They didn't avoid hardship. They prepared for it, planned around it, and found ways to extract meaning and growth from experiences that were genuinely difficult. They understood that resilience wasn't about avoiding challenges, but about developing the skills and mental frameworks necessary to endure and overcome them. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually lived better lives than modern people, but their winter survival achievements suggest capabilities that we may have lost in our climate-controlled, resource-abundant world. They possessed practical skills, psychological resilience, and social cooperation abilities that enabled them to thrive under conditions that would challenge modern survival experts. The most profound lesson from medieval winter survival might be their understanding that hardship shared is hardship halved. While hardship faced alone often becomes impossible to bear, they created communities of mutual dependence where individual success was impossible without collective success, where helping others was a survival strategy rather than charitable obligation. As you prepare to leave Thomas's world and return to your centrally heated, well-supplied modern life, you carry with you the knowledge that human beings are capable of extraordinary endurance when necessity demands it. You understand that the ancestors who created the foundation for modern civilization weren't just lucky or primitive. They were remarkably sophisticated survivors who developed techniques for thriving under conditions that would challenge anyone. The water continues to drip from Thomas's roof, each drop a promise that winter's grip is finally loosening, that spring will return as it always has, and that another generation has successfully passed through the crucible that has tested human resilience since the beginning of time. Now, as these medieval voices fade into the quiet murmur of history, let yourself settle deeper into your warm bed, appreciating the miracle of constant heat, abundant food, and the security that our ancestors fought so hard to create for us. Their struggles echo softly across the centuries, whispering stories of endurance that helped build the world you know today. Close your eyes and let their hard-won wisdom carry you gently toward dreams of spring's eternal promise, knowing that human resilience runs deeper than winter's coldest night.